Welcome to the second day of the Baltic Summer School of Digital Humanities. This day's program will be slightly longer compared to other days. I'm sure it will be worth it. In the afternoon, we will continue the parallel Python and R sessions. So yesterday we covered the basics. Today we go forwards with more advanced text analysis and visualization tasks. In the morning session, our guests are two historians. One of them will continue yesterday's main topic, the working with digitized historical newspapers. It will be Dr. Jani Marjanen, but our first guest is also a historian, medievalist, but he is has worked more with databases. And he is connected to us today from another continent. Dr. Javier is a historian, associate professor at Seoul National University, and the principal investigator of the Big Data Studies Lab at Seoul National University. As an intellectual historian of medieval Korea and as a technologist, Dr. Cha has been active in the digital humanities community for 14 years. He is a recipient of the prestigious Innovative and Pioneering Research Scheme, which provides financial support for his digital research lab. He serves on editorial boards of the International Journal of Humanities and Arts Computing and Corsair Mundi, as well as in the International Nominations Committee for the Digital Humanities Awards. Please, Dr. Javier.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bakane. Let me share my screen and begin. Hi, thank you for that kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I may be a little bit out of it because until next Monday, I am associate professor of East Asian Studies, even though I primarily research and teach digital humanities these days at Seoul National University. And as of the 1st of August, I will relocate to Hong Kong. I will be, to my knowledge, Hong Kong's first full-time faculty hired specifically to research and teach digital humanities and to train. To my knowledge, starting this coming academic year, we have a new Bachelor of Arts program that is called Humanities in Digital Technologies. So I'll be teaching in that program. So until the Monday, I'm based in Seoul. This weekend, I will move to Hong Kong, and hopefully we can stay in touch and let this networking and this relationship with Latvia and also the Baltic states at large continue. As I was introduced by Anda, I'm an intellectual historian of medieval Korea, and I've been a practitioner of the digital humanities thanks to the introduction to this wonderful field by Professor Peter Ball at Harvard. Some of you may have heard, if you've been active in the digital humanities community, you may have heard of the project called China Biographical Database Project, called CBDB. He has been the director of the project for a long time. So through my advisor on the China side, he introduced me to digital humanities, so I've been a practitioner since then. And today's topic is mainly about something like this, more of a conventional approach. So I have two major research areas when it comes to digital humanities. One is trying to figure out what innovative and effective methods we can develop as the source materials. So as when I began graduate school, my primary sources were still primarily in this form, large collections of printed materials. Some of them are reprints of medieval and early modern print codex. But over time, since around 2005, increasingly, primary sources have been scanned, typed, and also verified for accuracy, translated, and eventually made accessible to researchers via databases and large-scale portals. And in the case of Korean studies, as you can imagine, South Korea is famous around the world as one of the leaders in IT technologies and digital cultures. The same applies to the areas related to the humanities. So most primary sources these days, so researchers, when we begin our research questions, we never pick up a book. We always begin our research with databases. I have another research area called big data studies, which has more to do with contemporary production of what we call big data today, usually non-textual, non-structured, unstructured, very large scale data production happening today. And I inquire what new historical questions we need to ask in this new context we're dealing with from the perspective of somebody who studies the Middle Ages in East Asia. So I look at it from a very long-term perspective, 500 to 1,000 years. In what ways do historians need to prepare so that when the 21st century becomes the distant past, what kind of research will be made possible and what kind of preparation we need to engage in at this point. But today I will talk about mainly more the traditional approach to digital humanities, which is also one of my major research areas, and in fact something that I spent a lot of time contemplating since graduate school, since 2008 when I entered this domain called digital humanities. Today's talk I'll try my best to wrap up in about 40 minutes from now. I'll just cover 3 points. Otherwise I can just go on forever because there's so much to cover. So I'll give you a brief overview about the origins of digital Korean studies, because I imagine most people here are not familiar with when digitization and when digital methods were introduced to the field of Korean studies. And then I'll talk a little more broadly, so I'll step outside of my primary domain and engage with you from the perspective of digital historical scholarship and what specific challenges I've noticed over the course of more than a decade of engagement with this type of approach. And third, I will talk about an effective and robust way of building a digital platform. So the technology I will introduce today, I'll eventually get to this. What exactly is this? And why I made some choices along the way, and why I chose this particular way of organizing my digitized data, which comes to me in this form, and I transport this into this, which is a graph database management system called Neo4j. So it's a graph-driven database platform, and I'll explain briefly, as concisely as possible, explain how I arrived at this conclusion and what kind of new queries and what kind of new research questions I can ask thanks to the creation of this new approach. If you're interested in some more details, I also have a YouTube video on the origins of digital Korean studies. So there are some materials that eventually, after about, I think it was like 6 or 7 years, I've been giving the same talk, and I decided to retire most of the contents and not repeat myself anymore. I got so sick of hearing me talking about the same things over and over again. But I will talk a little bit about, since for many of you, Korean studies will be new, I will take some tidbits from this lecture today, and I will recycle a little bit. But if you're interested in more details, the extended version is all available on YouTube. You can just search for my name, Javier Chao, on YouTube. I only have 2 YouTube lectures. I'm not very active on YouTube. It'll be easy to find this. So the beginnings of digital Korean studies it goes back to the 1960s. It's really surprising how far back it goes. So those of you who are familiar with Josephine Miles, we're talking 1940s, Roberto Busa, I think was 49 when he first met the CEO of IBM, Watson. And I think the actual start to the the Index Thomisticus project was in the 60s. So around the same time, there were two historians of Korea, one based at Harvard. This is Edward Wagner. He is, in East Asia, in East Asian studies, we care a lot about genealogies, including intellectual genealogies. So if you trace back my intellectual ancestry, he is my intellectual great-grandfather. He's my advisor's advisor at Harvard. 1960s, he was the first professor of Korean history at Harvard. And he, in 1964, welcomed a visitor from South Korea. His name is Song Junho. And Professor Song was originally a historian of China, but as a Korean himself, and as somebody who could read classical Chinese sources, he was interested in collecting source materials and reconstructing the power structure of 15th and 16th century Korean society, which also happened to be Professor Wagner's dissertation topic. It was about 15th century power struggles in the Korean court. Initially, he was very interested in using I think Harvard's name value and access to large funds to go around and collect materials. As you can imagine, 1960s South Korea was still a very poor country. It was soon after the Korean War, and after 36 years of colonization, historical materials were scattered all over the world. Some of them were in the United States, some of them were in Europe, some of them were in Japan, and even the ones in South Korea were not organized properly. So he was mainly interested in organizing all these scattered pieces. But Edward Wagner had a different approach to this. He said, in the United States, there's this computing boom happening. So he suggested to Song Junho, why don't we use computers and turn this project into a database project, which is incredible. We're talking 1960s. And right away, they ran into all kinds of issues. And I introduced these issues to you because I think there's a lot of text analysis happening in your summer school this week. So in the case of Korean studies, it's by definition a multilingual and multi-script discipline. And I think this is not really surprising to many of you who are working with Eastern European sources. But we're also talking about multiple language families here. I think that's maybe one difference between what you encounter in Eastern Europe versus Korean studies. But I guess in the case of the Baltic states, you might also have to deal with multiple scripts. So we have not only alphabetic scripts, but Sinitic scripts, so Chinese characters, what we usually colloquially call. So a lot of classical Chinese sources are in Sinitic characters like this. And you also have, of course, the phonetic Hangul text. So it looks like this. And one thing really interesting about Korean sources, textual sources, is that there are two input methods, and the two input methods result in two very different ways of representing the text in digital form. One is called two-set, which is the most typical way of inputting Korean phonetic text. But there's also something called three-set, which comes from, if you look at this, some of you may have guessed already, but this is coming from typewriter days. So Korean has initial, vowel, and a final. And for typewriters, the initial, vowel, and the final parts were all, they basically belong to different types on the typewriter. So the three-set input system retains the legacy of typewriters, whereas the two-set is more like a born digital way of inputting source Korean textual source materials. So this Munka project began in the 60s, continued for about 40 years. And in the meantime, there were also other scholars and a businessman, an academic / businessman, who was inspired by the legacy of what Wagner and Song Junho had created, and wanted to do something different, but using computing as well. They were inspired by their innovative uses and early uses of computing. So in the 1980s, there is this figure, he's Professor Kim Hyun at the Academy of Korean Studies, basically the mastermind behind a lot of the digitized archive we see in Korean studies today. As you can see here, he's a very peculiar and interesting and eccentric character. He's a very artisanal type, you might say. He creates his own flute. So he basically literally cuts down bamboo trees, straightens it, tunes it, and He just loves making things. He's also one of the most innovative figures in digital Korean studies. Back in the 1980s, he was writing a dissertation on Korean Neo-Confucian philosophy, about key philosophy. It can't be more traditional than that. But he got interested in encoding issues when he got involved in a digital dictionary project that basically is a dictionary project for Sinitic characters to modern standard Korean. And because it involved a lot of digital work, he got interested in text encoding issues. And after training for about 10 years, he became one of the leading experts in South Korea in text encoding issues. And with this knowledge, he tried to do something that even Wagner and Song were not able to do so. And so to do this, he partnered up with a former academic, this Gun, who was a professor at my current institution at Seoul National University in the Graduate School of Public Administration. And but for some details that I don't want to get into too much, there were some political issues. He eventually left academia during in South Korea's dark days of dictatorship, military dictatorship, and became a businessman who was really good at fundraising for academic projects. So what they proceeded to do is digitize the entire 500 plus year long daily records of the Joseon Dynasty court. This is the early modern Korean kingdom. So from 1392 to 1910, we have detailed daily accounts of the conversations that took place between the king and his ministers in the Korean peninsula. So in the 1990s, Kim Hyun creates for the first time a CD-ROM edition of the Annals of the Joseon Dynasty, which later it gets sold to the Institute of Institute of Korean History. I forgot the exact name, but it's an institution that is in charge, government-funded institution is in charge of providing access to historical source materials of this kind. Initially, it was only capable of doing simple keyword text searches, but as I will demonstrate later in this talk, it is now capable of doing something much more advanced because the backend is a set of very detailed, very thoroughly annotated set of XML documents. And then something else happened as Kim Hyun was partnering up with a businessman like Gun, and through a startup company published like the digital edition of the Annals of the Joseon Dynasty. Something happened in South Korea, which those of us who were worried about the global economic situation these days might find relatable. So in 1997, South Korea was experiencing a very high point in economic development. Koreans were very, very proud that, through hard work and through decades of economic development through manufacturing, reached a certain level of economic development until something called the Imf crisis, the Asian financial crisis, sweeps across East and Southeast Asia. So suddenly, South Koreans find themselves in an economic recession, a major economic recession. And what happens during this time of economic recession is that the government implements a stimulus package, which initially was meant to go to infrastructure building, in fact, physical infrastructure building like highways, roads, construction, and so on. But because South Korea was already a very developed economy, many people, and in many cases, because South Korea tends to be very patriarchal, many of them were men who had white-collar jobs, were unwilling to go out and take on blue-collar work. So they appealed to the government and said, can we do something different that involves desk work? So all that money, the millions of dollars that were allocated to infrastructure building, went to digital heritage construction. So basically what they did is they had thousands of people who were unemployed and told them, now you have a desk job and your task is to digitize Korea's rich cultural heritage. And as you can see here, tens of millions of euro has been allocated to this this agenda alone. So we're talking hundreds of millions of euro invested into the digitization and cultural heritage for more than 25 years. So as a result of all that, researchers today no longer use printed source materials, but we access our information via these platforms, which is open not only to South Koreans, but any researcher interested in Korea, as long as you can read the materials. And not only textual sources, but museum heritage collections, like the 8,000 plus items at the central location of the National Museum of Korea. The entire thing is available to researchers. And in the case of Korean history, more than 100 databases are provided to researchers in open access on the web like this via a very nice interface for doing all kinds of advanced searches. And what is remarkable about, to me, what is remarkable about Korean studies, and I'm sure many of you will agree with me, is that the raw data files are downloadable thanks to a bill that passed circa 2014. So something called the Korea Open Government License that was in discussion from 2011 to 2013, and eventually becomes officially passes in 2014, stipulates that any publicly funded digital project, digitization project that was paid for by South Korean taxpayer money has to be made available to the general public, officially to South Korean citizens only. But if you're not a South Korean citizen, in my case, I'm a Canadian citizen. So technically, this is not given to me for the purpose of me using this material. But if I ask a Korean friend with a Korean passport, any Korean citizen can request this, and the institutions are obligated to share the raw data files. And by raw data files, I mean the entire like XML, the full text, or RDF, any file format that they create, they are obligated to share it with the Korean public. Okay. So to recap, this is what happened. Early start in 1960s, and encoding issues that the pioneers had to deal with. 1980s, you had Kim Hyun interest in digital dictionaries. 1990s, CD-ROM versions of the Joseon dynasty, and something that happened during the Asian financial crisis. We end up with all these wonderful databases available to researchers and downloadable to thanks to the open license bill that passes in 2014. Okay. Now I want to move on to the second part of my talk, which is about what to do with all this. So in the context of my field, my primary field, which is Korean history, we don't talk so much about digitization of oral CR because the raw data are already there. So for me, the question has always, for a long time, has been, how do I access, not how I access the data or how I do OCR to extract information from scanned pages, but rather when I have so much really high quality and rich digitized information sources, what do I do with these things? So to tackle this question, I can approach it in multiple ways, but maybe just to simplify, and because many of you are already experts in digital humanities, I won't dwell on this too long. I think you can think of it in here. So my screen sharing stopped for some reason. Okay. So the two major tracks in the digital humanities, one is competition literary studies, which there are many ways of writing this history, but I think many of us, I think it's safe to say many of us will agree that one of the pioneers in this particular subfield is Josephine Miles, who was the first woman to be tenured at UC Berkeley, used punch cards with her graduate students to analyze Irish poems, statistical analysis of Irish poems. And we have another pioneers, and I introduced two of them today, right? One is the more well-known figure, Roberto Buza, who is formerly not an academic, but somebody very important in the field of digital humanities, a Jesuit priest interested in Thomas Aquinas, got the support of IBM to create an archive. So rather than focusing on the computing potential of computers, of digital technologies, he was more interested in creating digital archives. And you can see something very similar happening with Edward Wagner, with Song Junho, and also with these figures, the people who were inspired by the potential of CD-ROM in the 1990s, and later the ability to share and access information easily and in a very inexpensive way on the web. So you can say two aspects. One group of people who are more interested in the computing potential of digital technologies, and the other more on creating archives. And also think about all these debates happening, especially in the very heated debates happening in the subfield called computational literary studies. Like, is there a distinction between literary studies versus literary history? What is data-driven versus data-assisted scholarship? When you have a large corpus, how do we timestamp a corpus? And also all these issues of representation and archives. So starting from not only some of the earlier works of Franco Moretti and Matthew Jockers, if you are familiar with some of the more recent publications like Catherine Bode, Andrew Piper, Ted Underwood, and Hoyt Long, we can start debating about what exactly does it mean. Like, so if you follow Ted Underwood, to engage in something called quantitative humanities, to what extent should humanities scholars focus on quantitative methods? How do we make that, how is quantitative humanities different from quantitative social sciences? But if you look at people like Hoyt Long, who works on Japanese literature, and people like Catherine Bode, who works in English literature, but in the context of Australia, we get a very different approach to digital scholarship, where they're more interested in the collection of data and the representation of their corpus. So for those scholars who don't have access to HathiTrust, or those scholars for whom HathiTrust is not their main source of corpus, they have to build their own corpus. So in the case of Australia, Catherine Bode had to scan newspapers because Australian authors tended to serialize their publications of newspapers. So she had to begin literally with scanned newspaper pages running OCR, and then began to wonder about what exactly does it mean to do digital scholarship in this context, and also focus a lot on sampling issues, which is, I think, a reflection that is relatively absent, going back even to, I think, Moretti and Jockers. There's a very confident way that I think Moretti and Jockers, if you read their scholarship carefully, there's this assumption that whatever they're having access to, the corpus is so large that they think is a fairly good representation of everything that has ever been produced in the literary world. But if you follow Bode, or if you follow Hoyt Long, they're much more careful about what is being represented in their digital corpus, and there's a lot of extensive discussion about sampling issues. You can also think about data-driven versus data-assisted methodologies. This is discussed extensively in Miguel Escobar Varela's Theater as Data, somebody who works on theater studies. But if you haven't read his book, it's open access through University of Michigan Press. I highly recommend it. There's an entire chapter dedicated to digital methods that I think should be discussed more openly and more extensively by those of us in the digital humanities community. In my case, I've been interested a lot in this notion of creating a digital macroscope for historical research. And this idea, so those of you who are familiar with Milligan, suddenly can't remember the other person, Milligan and Weingart and Graham. So the historian's macroscope, right? Exploring big historical data. There's a whole monograph co-authored by these three major figures in digital humanities, something called Exploring Big Historical Data, the historian's macroscope. That term is not something that those three authors came up with. In fact, the person who popularized this in the digital humanities community is the information scientist Kathy Berner in an article written in 2012, who said a macroscope intends to provide a vision of the whole, helping us synthesize the related elements and detect patterns, trends, and outliers while granting access to myriad details. And this idea, I don't think there's a direct connection between Berner and this historian in 1958, but it is an idea that was proposed multiple times in the academic world over the past few decades. So another historian named Philip Bagby in 1958 proposed that he wanted to create something called a macroscope. And here, he didn't have digital approaches in mind. He just kind of wished that there was something like this. I think he used it more like a metaphor rather than an actual concrete tool that we can create. So his definition of a macroscope is an instrument which would ensure that the historian will see only the larger aspects of history and blind them to the individual details and maintain this higher level of abstraction and decipher the principal patterns of historical change. You can see a little bit of overlap with historical social sciences, and also this desire to not be distracted too much by the details, but try to pick up at a higher level of abstraction the broader patterns in historical change and in historical timeline. And Graham, Milligan, and Weingart also have their own definitions of macroscope. So with a macroscope, they hope to have, they define it as a different set of tools. And here they mean things that are standard package in digital humanities training these days, like Gephi, Cytoscape, even Neo4j, R, Python. So various tools that we use for exploring data in different scales. And I think this is very important here. It has to be very flexible, has to be very robust. It has to give you different points of view at different scales. So a macroscope is assumed from Kathy Berner on to be digital. And thanks to the power of digital technologies, it should provide us with an observation what is once too great, show, or complex for the human eye and mind to notice and comprehend. Okay. So I also had a similar idea. Initially, when I entered the digital humanities field, I didn't think of my approach as, I didn't think that I was creating a macroscope. But I think many of us end up doing something like this. Right? So just to illustrate my point, this is kind of like what I did. So when I first entered digital humanities, the semester before I officially entered this field, I wrote a seminar paper on Korean intellectual figures in the 15th century. And by chance, I was just rummaging through the pages of an intellectual biographical dictionary and found all kinds of connections among these like 10 or 11 figures that were very important in my seminar paper. And then I got curious, like these guys are all interconnected. So is this a part of a broader network, or what exactly is it? Is there a way of doing this in a different way? As you can see, I use basically very rudimentary. I use Microsoft Word to draw these things using a table. I have a background in web design, so I was thinking kind of like HTML table and borders and whatever. I drew this by hand. And later when I learned Cytoscape and Gephi, I noticed, oh gosh, this is a part of a much larger network, and not only simply much larger, but we're talking like maybe 3,000 plus nodes and edges. Okay? So you can do something like this using a digital macroscope. And this is basically Wagner's examination database. So something that was built since the 1960s, available to us now on open access. You can visualize the connections among those individuals using either Gephi or Cytoscape, depending on your choice of software. And it can also add additional data to what you already have. So in my case, there are many genealogies that have survived in Korean history. So the 1465 edition of the Andong Kwon genealogy, I have a digital edition of this, so I try to visualize that. I also have stone inscriptions, basically tombstone inscriptions, which have very detailed kinship records about major figures, the aristocrats who passed away. So you can turn that into a data set and examine it. And with by collaborating with one of my former students who is a physicist, but a physicist who is interested in social issues, he's a type of social physicist. we try to do a time series network analysis of something, because the data set goes on for 500 years. So we try to use a time series approach to provide a summary of what happened across those 500 years, and try to make a very intuitive statistical summary of data sets that consist of maybe 20,000 plus nodes and edges. I try to track social mobility changes, although this is more like a proxy indicator. It's not exactly social mobility, but at least a proxy indicator. We can see that something that takes place before and after a devastating and a highly destructive war in 1592. 1592 is when Japan invades Korea, and the war lasts for about 7 years, highly destructive. And you can see that before and after the war, there's some drastic change in society happening, and this time series method picks it up. There's another thing I also experimented with, which takes genealogical data and also epitaphs, the tombstone inscriptions. And one thing I noticed in genealogical data that you don't really see, or you don't often see in social network data, the usual like friendship network data, is that marriage network data has a lot more restrictions, because I'm sure this is common in most societies, but in East Asia, traditionally, if you're a Confucian society, one male is allowed to have multiple partners, multiple concubines, but legally, you're allowed to have one wife. In the case of China, it's a little more complicated, but in Korea, it was much more strict. So legally, only one wife was recognized as legal. And because of that restriction, and because many major aristocratic lineages try to intermarry among their close circle, but at the same time didn't want to make the marriage too endogamous, you find that when you visualize it, you identify the existence of these very interesting rings of edges. So this is something that in Cytoscape, this is something you also observe in R. And you can use Python's NetworkX to extract those rings. So anything that goes in a full circle, with NetworkX, now you're able to extract what those rings are. So I've tried something like that as well. But all these approaches look very interesting. And for, I think, newcomers of digital humanities, looks impressive, apparently. But in terms of historical scholarship, there are some major limitations to this approach. As you notice in all these examples, basically what they're doing is exploratory data analysis of only one particular digitized historical source material. So this is the Wagner database visualized. This is another representation of the same data set. And this is a particular set of genealogies. But it is very difficult to make observations across multiple databases. And you see this limit recognized by some other digital historians as well. And you notice some similar observations that can be made in other major scholarship in digital history. So to give you one example, Robert Nelson's Mining Dispatch. It's a wonderful project based in the University of Richmond. They digitized a local newspaper called The Dispatch. And in the 19th century, and for those of us familiar with American history, this is a time of the American Civil War and the emancipation of slavery. So there are a lot of references to slavery and also patriotism. And we even find like literary pieces being published there. So they basically run topic models on this particular collection called The Dispatch. So the question becomes, is this project basically a macroscopic view of this collection, this newspaper called The Dispatch, or is it telling us something about this particular area of the United States at large? You can say the same thing about this, which is another wonderful article and happens to be a good friend of mine. So I want to be a little careful with the way I phrase this. But you also see in Ian Miller's Rebellion, Crime, and Violence in Qing China, basically a topic modeling of state-related outbreaks of violence from 1722 to 1911 using basically the Chinese equivalent of the daily court accounts. It's called the Shulu, the veritable records of the Qing dynasty. So the emperor's daily audience with his officials, and using the extensive corpus that covers roughly 200 years, he runs topic modeling on it to make an interesting argument. But Ian Miller also points out the limitations to this approach. And among the many limitations, he also recognizes that this is basically a reflection of an observation being made in Beijing using this particular corpus. So in many cases in digital historical scholarship, we're limited to analysis of a particular corpus. But that is not usually how historians approach a research project. If you imagine, like, if in a non-digital context, if our article or our book basically relies on just one set of primary source materials, we will find that very suspicious. Like, what is going on? You only look at the Beijing's perspective. Why don't you look at other sources, right? Generally, in non-digital context, historical scholarship involves extensive uses of hundreds of observations being made about the particular topic. But in digital historical scholarship, when we create our macroscope, we tend to limit our perspective to a one set of digitized source materials, one digitized repository. And I can continue the discussion of various problems that arise when we handle digitized editions of our primary sources. I don't want to go on into too much detail because I think I'm running out of time soon. But you can also do what tends to be also absent in digital historical scholarship is source criticism. So before the digital archive became a digital archive, we need to think about from where did this particular information come from, and is it reliable, and are there any conflicting information? So in the case of Wagner's examination database, we see that there's a reference to that destructive war in 1592 right away. So what happened during the war is that anything that was created, so a lot of the records, exam records created before 1592 was basically wiped clean. So any examination records, state examination records from before 1592 was destroyed. So pre-1592 records were reconstructed from memory. So we need to think about this. In today's digital archive, if we don't engage in source criticism, we don't know this. But as a historian, you need to think about this. This is very serious. It was reconstructed from memory in the post-war period. Okay? So it was restored by people with apparently excellent memory. So can we trust it? So when I do this, is this trustworthy? Method-wise, I thought it was interesting. Right? Well, I pointed this out in the article too. Can we trust? You can maybe trust the analysis, but can we trust the data? Because it was restored in the post-war period. We also noticed during the post-war period, the examination records, the original materials that survived to this day, and then later became a digital version that we use today, what that scholars use today, came in multiple editions. They were state-sanctioned official records, and there are also commercial editions. And one big difference between the two is that once in a while you find conflicting information. So somebody's name may have been spelled differently, or some records don't match. So you think about when you have conflicting information, how do you resolve that? But also the commercial editions, because it's commercial, they're being sold. You think about why did people in the 18th and 19th century interested in purchasing basically what is a list of names? And because they were commercial editions, the vendors have to make it, the publisher has to make it interesting. So the commercial editions, as you see here, comes with extensive commentaries and interesting stories pertaining to those individuals, which is absent in the official government edition. But in today's digital edition, these stories are absent. So somebody made this choice. Somebody decided not to include these stories in the digital editions today, and basically make the government edition as the foundational text for today's digital edition. We also find something that colloquially we call data contamination in digital historical scholarship. What I mean by this is basically that we take information from centralized digital repositories provided to us by through official channels, but most scholars don't simply take that and use them as face value. We end up usually creating our own versions, our own data set based on the information that we downloaded through those official channels. So this is my Javier Chas version of the examination records. And as you can see, as a medievalist, I tend not to look at anything past 1700. Even that is very late for me. Usually the latest information I look at is like 1570s and 1580s. But I do a lot of cleanup. And you can also think about like, what do I mean by cleanup? When you have conflicting information or when you have encoding errors, I tend to correct them, but I don't, in most cases, I don't introduce the correction back to the centralized repository. So Javier Chas creates Javier Chas' own edition of the examination records. And this is my colleague Park Hyun-soon at Seoul National University, who is less interested in the Middle Ages and more interested in the early modern period. So her interest tends to begin in the 1700s. And she has her own corrections. So there's a part edition of the same digital archive. So how do we reconcile this? What are the implications of all this? I'm sure many of you can relate to the stories I'm telling you today. It doesn't have to be specific to Korean history, but I'm sure happening in the context of other digital historical scholars happening elsewhere. We also have the problem with data heterogeneity, where the survival of materials before and after 1592 is incredible. There's just so much more information that survived in Korean history post 1592 versus pre. And the data format tends to be heterogeneous as well. So the format that Korean historical archives tend to come is XML, but not all databases, when you download the raw data, are designed in XML. Some are in the form of RDF, some are in the form of relational databases, some, and as you can see, sometimes we also use other types of database management technologies. So as a resolution of all this, I came up with this notion because, especially in the context of digital Islamic studies, this notion of text reuse, it was coined from what I know, people who do Islamic studies, basically to study the commentarial traditions in the Islamic world, which you can also apply to, I think, to the Confucian tradition of adding commentaries and study that computationally. But in my case, I was thinking, can we reuse portions of relevant data sources for my specific research question, combine them all, and in the case of medieval studies, so one thing I tend to find myself doing over and over is that I'm a specialist of the time period that precedes 1592, this period. But because the survival rate of post-1592 data is so much better, I kept finding myself doing digital scholarship using sources from a time period that I'm not so interested in, right? Early modern period is also okay, but I'm primarily a medievalist. So I thought, what do I do to study this? Very little has survived, and to do good scholarship with such a small quantity of data. So my approach was to take as much information as possible from multiple sources and engage in something called central database management using this graph database, which is one of the most common use cases for this database platform. Something called Neo4j to increase the density of connections as much as possible across entities that pertain to the pre-1592 time period. So try to overcome this issue with unwieldy macroscopes. So this is a Gephi representation, a cytoscape representation of the examination database, a Gephi representation of the entire thing, 500 years. But I wanted to move beyond this. So one thing you can do is using cytoscape, maybe zero in on a specific node and do selections. So in Cytoscape, you can do this rather easily. You can choose adjacent nodes and adjacent edges, pull out a subnetwork and study those subnetworks manually in a non-digital way, but use digital tools to extract what you think might be interesting from the visualization. But I thought there must be a more effective way of doing this, something more interesting, something more efficient, and something more robust. So I came up with this idea called Medieval Yangon Project, and the data sets used for this can be found in my GitHub page. I haven't updated it for a while, but I will update it with a new version pretty soon when it's ready. So basically, I draw relevant data sources for corresponding to the medieval time period. And Yangban here is a Korean term for aristocrats, people who served in the central bureaucratic offices. So the idea is to increase the edge density across these nodes as much as possible and run cipher queries to enable discovery of things that historians may have missed when we did our historical scholarship in a traditional way. So this kind of thing becomes possible. The nodes don't have to be necessarily human figures, don't have to be historical figures. They can be also references to bibliographic information, references to whether or not these people left behind private writings, or whether or not these figures were given prestigious titles. So you can do queries of this kind, and even indirectly in the database management system, you can do some basic visualizations and try to extract subsets of information corresponding to the specific queries that are done in a native graph way. So here is an example of, in 1392, there's dynastic change, regime change. So post-regime change, were the civil bureaucrats, the major civil bureaucrats, post-regime change, were they intermarrying to each other? And you can kind of see that, yes, indeed, they're intermarrying with one another. So here, it looks a bit messy, but it is possible also to pull this out as a CSV output of all the nodes corresponding that are shown here in a visual way. And right away, you can do a comparison, civil versus military figures. So post-regime change, what you see here is that most major military figures either left behind very little or no records about their kinship information, or I think what most likely happened was that they were purged. So they didn't left behind offspring. So right away, you can see civil versus military difference, post-regime change. And you can also do something a little more complicated. There were some, in Korean history, there were prestigious titles given to officials who, during times of political turmoil, if you join the right camp and you win, if your hedging turns out to be correct, you're given this very prestigious investiture called merit subjects. You're meritorious, you're a very loyal and meritorious person. And between the 1327 and 1589, there were something like, I think nearly 40 instances. I need to check my records again, but there were many instances. And Edward Wagner originally was interested in the merit subjects of 1392, 1398, all the way to 1504 and 1519, and ended there. So one thing I wanted to do is explore merit subjects that in the conventional scholarship, historians have tended to ignore, like the merit subjects of 1589, and see, is there a continuity between merit subjects of 1469 and 1589? And this is the query output of that search. So you can choose all the merit subjects of 1569 and all the merit subjects of 1589 and see the connections. And if there's a particular long-term connection happening, you can identify who they are and try to find who exactly are they. And here you also notice multiple edges added. The multiple edges here don't mean that the centrality value is higher. The multiple edges here mean that there are, in this instance, this is confirming that this guy's name is Shin Suk-ju. This is Shin Jang. So Shin Suk-ju is Shin Jang's son. And 3 data sources confirm that Shin Suk-ju is his son. So if you have 3 data sources confirming this, chances are this connection is a pretty reliable connection. So it's not about centrality, but more about, okay, so I can kind of trust this. You know from where this connection was declared, and you can try to go back and check. But this kind of checking that you normally would have done by rummaging through dictionary pages can be done within the context of Neo4j, and also can be done, can also place these connections in the context of broader patterns that you can see through this kind of output as well. Normally, when I give this kind of talk, I also do a demo of Neo4j, but to do all this, it takes a long time, so I'm going to skip this part. I'm going to just end my presentation here, and I think it'd be more productive if we switch over to Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cha. Give me a second.
Yes.
So, as usually, I will be looking forwards to questions in the chat, but also in the room. Is there a question in the room? Not yet. So I have several questions. First of all, thank you so much for this critical outlook at the digital humanities. You would think that people in our position who are enthusiasts of digital humanities would not criticize these approaches so heavily. But on the other hand, I think we have to be aware of the issues related to data criticism, evaluating our sources, and to seeing the limitations of our methods. And I suspect Jani, Marjanen, and later today also will touch upon these issues. But I was wondering, in your research, so how individualistic versus teamwork is your research? Because it is not a secret that since the beginning of the usage of quantitative methods and in historical research, even before the digital era, the quantitative methods were related to factory-like work, where people would work on preparing data and analyzing it. And in your daily work, are you an individualistic researcher, or you require a team to prepare your data?
Normally, I approach my research, I put together a team normally, but in this particular case that involves the medieval Yangon project, I work individually. And the reason for that is, first of all, there are not that many people who are interested in medieval Korean history and my particular topic. And the reason I am able to approach this in an individualistic way is because the data sets are all made available on open access by other researchers who went through the painstaking process of creating these data sources. So I give full credit to what they did. And in my Neo4j, there is basically a record for giving credit. So when we have multiple sources confirming that so-and-so is a son, it's not only that a particular primary source from 500 years ago confirms this, or genealogy confirms this, but I also mention who digitized this information. And because those things are already available, all I have to do is go through my Neo4j database and check for errors, check for duplicates, do disambiguation. It's still a lot of work, but it is possible to do this kind of work as an individual. If I have an academic partner who's also interested in my particular type of scholarship, I would love to put together a team and do this. But this particular project happens to be an individual project. In the context of other digital humanities scholarship, I always work with teams. And I do have weekly lab meetings and the usual thing that I'm sure many of you are familiar with.
Thank you. I see one question in the chat. Do you ensure by some statistical analysis the validity of retold data?
Very interesting question. Thank you. I don't. I only use cipher queries to do disambiguation. So I try to pull out a list of records that are either repetitive or in a misleading way confirmed to be unique connections or unique nodes. There are ways of doing that, and I use cipher queries to do that. But the reason I don't use statistical analysis is because I'm dealing with a particular time period that don't have a whole lot of source materials that have survived. So the idea is to increase the density of the connections to make some new discoveries that other medievalists may have missed. We're talking like a very small sample here. For the early modern period, maybe you can do something more advanced, and I did use some statistical methods. But you also notice that when we do source criticism, the conclusion can be a little bit suspicious. So yeah, to answer your question, in the context of medieval Yangon project, I don't use statistics, at least not at the moment.
Thank you. There's another question. Have you made these network maps interactive? Dynamics over time, changes in power, civil, military, people flow under dynasties, fast, slow, etc.
Yes. And well, thank you for addressing me in Korean as well. This is the long-term plan. This part I think will be a team project. So when I move to Hong Kong, one of the first things I'll do is find funding and use. So for now, I'm using Neo4j's browser to do queries, but eventually I want the Neo4j to be the backend, and I will have JavaScript libraries doing visualization and enabling queries of medieval sources. So yes, so the changes in power, civil versus military, people flows, changing dynamics, social mobility, they all can be mapped. And that will be available on the online platform version of this database. But that will be coming in the next couple of years. And that will be a team project. I will work with a developer and think about some effective ways of doing something like this.
Thank you. I have another question. So you mentioned that the political decisions have been beneficial for digitization process in Korea. And yourself, you have worked in various parts of the world, in Canada also. And can you compare how is the situation for digital humanities, for example, Canada compared to Korea? Do you feel that in Korea the situation is somewhat better?
Mm-hmm. I would like to hear other people's thoughts on this too. It's something that I've been, in an informal way, like we're having some beer with some colleagues. I talk about this, but not so much in a formal setting like this, because I wasn't sure if it's appropriate to bring up something that can be a little bit sensitive, I think. One thing I noticed with the digital turn over the last 10 or so years is that originally in my career plans, I didn't expect to find myself in South Korea. So as a Korea specialist, I did visit Korea regularly to find sources, to collaborate with other researchers and talk to them and to follow the latest trends and so on. But I actually worked here physically for 5 years and decided to move. I was based in Leiden University for a bit, and something I noticed, it's not specific to Leiden, but in many parts of the world, is that digital humanities funding tends to be much easier if you work on a project that involves that country. So it was very hard to justify. So when I'm in Europe, very hard to, I think if you work on something like China, it's a big country, the major country, so you can kind of, people generally take interest right away. You work on a country like Korea and try to get funding in Canada or in the Netherlands or in the EU, it's much trickier because these fundings are so much more competitive. And also same thing, if you work on early modern Belgium, I have a colleague who works in Belgium, early modern Belgium, they try to get funding from the South Korean government. It's not easy. So one thing that happened with the digital turn is that we kind of like went kind of backward in this regard. So to do digital Korean studies is much easier if you are based in South Korea. And I'm sure it's the same thing if you work on Latvia, it's better if you're in Latvia. Is this something that we can overcome? I'm not sure, but it's something that I'm hoping to discuss with the digital humanities community and think about ways of overcoming it. One way might be to do more international collaboration. Maybe the PI can be based in that country and do international collaboration with scholars based elsewhere. If we create more opportunities like that, maybe that'll be one kind of indirect, but it's I think a partial solution. But I'm not sure if other people have similar experience with this. So when a council or a committee evaluates the research, I think it's much easier if you are based in that continent or based in that country. And I think some areas tend to be more prioritized than others.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know what you think. Do you have any experience in Latvia?
It sounds very true what you say, I must say, because like in Latvia especially, there's a very huge emphasis on cultural heritage, and this is about Latvian cultural heritage mostly. I see another question in chat. You mentioned that the commercial data were discarded during digitization. Can it be that actually commercial resources are less censored and more truthful? Have you tried somehow to compare both resources?
No, I don't think commercial data were discarded. So commercial data, what I mean by commercial data there is that is commercial editions of early modern, commercial editions of the early modern primary source, pre-digitization. So not discarded, but the stories that were there, not discarded, but how do I put this? Not inputted to the digital edition. So somebody in the team deemed that having a roster alone is enough. Okay? I'm sure many of us who have worked with digitization can relate to this. This digital edition of an accurate representation of the printed version or the manuscript version that has survived to us, or do we make some choices? So in many cases, people who work with the examination databases are mainly interested in you asked me earlier, statistical approaches. So things like stories are not so important. And quite clearly, I think people who made the digital editions thought the same thing. So the stories were discarded, or maybe they didn't even know that they were commercial editions. Maybe they just started with the state editions first, and later scholars who worked on, who did extensive research on Korean examination culture discovered the commercial editions. But that's something that I need to investigate. We also have some private chats and things. Should I move on to the next question?
Yes, there's a question for Georgis. Maybe, Georgi, you want to ask it yourself, no? So your work is very reminiscent of the work being conducted on the China Biographical database, which indeed you mentioned. Have there been efforts to do research of, for example, social mobility of pooling data from both CBDB and Korean biographical data sets, and perhaps Japan?
Yes. So the director of CBDB, Peter Boll, is one of my advisors, and his book is one of the reasons I went to graduate school. So if I need to blame somebody for pulling me into academia, it was because I was inspired by his work. And he's the one who introduced me to the digital humanities. And as a graduate student, I also worked in the CBDB project, so I'm very familiar with the project. I do have one difference with the approach that CBDB has taken. So Michael Fuller, who is a professor of Chinese literature, but also a former software developer, he kind of is the technical mastermind who works on CBDB. And CBDB likes remaining a relational database, whereas my medieval Yangon approach is not so interested in turning that into a relational database. I did propose to Michael Fuller once that we should consider using Neo4j and try to represent CBDB in a different way. But I think because the project has been going on for several decades now, I think it's, and there are like something like 400,000 plus records that individuals need to deal with, and there are all kinds of information there, right? About not only the basic biographical information like year of birth, year of death, but also official records, genealogical records, social interactions, and so on and so forth. But I do think that anything, some subsets of CBDB, like kinship information and political association and friendship and so on and so forth, can be turned into graphs. So the approach that CBDB takes right now is basically run a Visual Basic script to loop through the records. So you can't do the kind of cipher queries I did. So if you have a natively graph query, it is not impossible to execute that in SQL or in Access, but it is very inefficient and it will take like several minutes plus. And some very specific cipher queries, I think, are simply impossible to execute in a relational database. But it would be good to have, I think, multiple versions of the same database. And that indeed is the approach that one of my Korean colleagues has taken. So it was one of the candidates for the Digital Humanities Award last year. It's called a GM diary. And the digital humanities person in charge of this basically turned a Korean aristocrat's diary from 1692 to 1699 into something like 5 different types of databases. And it became incredibly powerful. There's wiki, there's relational database, there's Neo4j, there's RDF, and there's XML as well. And I think that it seems very tedious, but I think that maybe is an incredibly good model for many projects to follow. It becomes much easier to reuse later. And the kind of platform we can create as a result of having access to those multiple database types, I think it opens new possibilities.
Thank you. Are there more questions from the room? If not, I have very last one from myself. So it seems that visualization is quite important in your work. You are visualizing relationships, relations, and networks. Do you agree with the notion that visualization has allowed researchers to represent knowledge in a way that was not accessible or possible before this digital era? Do you feel that you have discovered something, or this has allowed to represent you something in a way that wouldn't be possible without the visualization?
If you give me 30 seconds, I think I can pull out something interesting. So this is Edward Wagner's visualization of examination records manually designed GIS map from 1970s. So what is interesting about this is that with using punch cards and I think GIS was, I think some basic GIS was available in the 1970s maybe, but he didn't know how to map that data. So basically use color coding. And Wagner did write several papers based on his analysis of the examination records. And what is incredible is that the technology compared to today is not even comparable, but some of the observations he made was made for the first time in Korean historical scholarship, and very little of it was overturned. So now we have access to all these wonderful tools, but because we're looking at the same sources, but in a different digital representation, we reach more or less the same conclusions. Something new that we can do is something like this. I think this is something that Wagner wasn't able to do, so we can do something like this. That wasn't possible before, but I think the visualizations may not look so elegant, but in terms of results, it was very impressive. So how often is that we make new discoveries using visualizations and database queries? Hopefully my discoveries using things like this, eventually I haven't found something that other historians would find wow yet, but hopefully I can make some discoveries that will surprise my colleagues. So far I set up the database, but now I need to really explore, use the microscope to zero in on some things that my fellow medievalists have overlooked over the years. In that regard, I think visualization can be effective. But at the same time, when you have this, you can kind of intuitively say civil bureaucrats reproduce better compared to military officials. Yes, but when you have hairballs like this, it looks cool, but what can you do with this? Right? So I think with visualizations, I think many of us run into this issue. Sometimes things seem to be very clear, and sometimes we have hairballs. It's, I think, a matter of how we frame our research questions and how what this helps us resolve. I think it's very tricky. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm sure many of you also have been working on this field for a long time, but it's very hard to do data-driven or data-assisted scholarship that is persuasive enough to or comes up with a conclusion that will surprise our fellow colleagues.
Thank you. And with that, let's give a round of applause to our first speaker. Thank you so much for coming.
I wish I could have been there in person.
And if you can, maybe you can stay for our next speaker.
Sure.
Yes. Dr. Jani Marjanen will be giving a lecture on digital history between measuring and interpreting. Dr. Marjanen is a senior researcher at the University of Helsinki. He is a historian specializing in the history of patriotism and nationalism, the history of ideology, the history of newspapers and book printing, and the theory and methodology of conceptual history. In his work, he combines traditional historical inquiry with new methods from the digital humanities. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Should I be there? Is that better? I move a little bit. Yeah, I think that's fine. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Does it work if I have the mic like this, or should I keep it? I should have it like this. All right, let me put on a clock. So thank you so much for having me over. It's been a pleasure to be here. I also attended some of the workshops yesterday, and it is really, really interesting to see what you are doing, and it was really, really helpful to participate in some of the workshops yesterday, and I hope to do some of that today as well. My talk will be a kind of direct continuation from what Martin Düring was talking about yesterday. So I'm also talking about historical digitized newspapers, and basically everything Martin said yesterday is something that I subscribe to, and it also allows me to save some time in order so I can go into concrete research cases and not mention many of the things that he did so elegantly. But I will say something about why I feel it is important and fruitful to study these historical newspapers. And basically there are two main reasons for me. And the first one is that they are such an incredibly rich source of data. You can find most anything in the historical newspapers. And just one example of this is something that my colleague Neshma Omari did in the NewsEye project. The NewsEye project started in 2019, and then 2020 we were hit by a global pandemic, and it changed everything. And then, of course, what many historians did, including Neshma, was like going to the newspapers, going to the historical digitized sources to see if you can find something that relates to this. And she did a small case on using face masks during previous pandemics. And again, it's one of those things that maybe you would not have expected to start studying, but since the newspapers are such a rich source, and since they are so readily available, Neshma could go back to the materials, find interesting cases, and write a nice piece about that, which you can find on the homepage of the NewsEye project. The other reason is something that Martin also mentioned, and it's the long time span of newspapers, and that the fact that they form a semi-coherent long data set that allows you to look at trends in basically language use. Of course, it's always important to point out that a newspaper in the 18th century is not the same thing as a newspaper in the 20th century, so the medium in itself changes. But nonetheless, the newspapers allow for this long-term analysis. And that is what I do most of the time. So I'm quite interested in how political language develops, and I'm quite interested in using newspapers to study how that language that is used in the newspapers somehow reflects changes in people's worldviews. So the graph on your right-hand side, I'm not even going to tell you what it is, but that's the kind of stuff I like doing. So seeing a clear trend over time in history. And I'll have some more examples later on. With this notion in mind, I'd like to introduce a distinction that I find useful in thinking about my own research. It comes from Juho Pääkkönen and Petri Ylikoski, who did a philosophical piece where they studied how humanities and social science scholars use topic modeling. Their interest was coming from philosophy. They wanted to know how people think about doing scholarship, and they introduced this distinction into topic instrumentalism and topic realism. And this distinction kind of goes through everything we do with digitized newspapers, I think. And actually, I don't think it's limited to using topic models as a method. I'm assuming that everyone is reasonably familiar with topic models. And if you're not, there are plenty of people in this room who can explain them to you much better than I am. So I'm not going to go into this. But I'll explain the distinction between instrumentalism and realism. So it could be about topic models, but it could be also about a number of other methods. For instance, just using word frequencies. So instrumentalism in this distinction is about using digital methods, digital tools, to find something for your qualitative research. It could be about creating a corpus, or it could be about identifying a debate. For instance, say a typical thing would be that you do a word frequency plot, a relative word frequency plot, and then you see that there is a spike somewhere along the way. And that might indicate that, okay, maybe there is an interesting debate, and then you want to go back and read that debate. That would be a typical instrumentalist use of a digital method. Instrumentalism in general is very explorative, so you use the methods in order to get somewhere, but in the end, often the proof you give in making your argument in that study is qualitative. Realism, on the other hand, is about analyzing quantitative trends. So then again, taking the word frequency example, it would be like the plot I showed in the previous graph. So it would be something that shows a clear trend, and the assumption would be that this trend is indicative of something that happens in the data, and that is the quantitative proof we want to give. Then it's another question how we interpret that, but basically it's aiming for quantitative proof. The realism branch can also be quite explorative, but there are issues with different methods being differently transparent, and I'll get back to that. Often, in terms of working quantitatively in the kind of realist paradigm, proof also needs to be statistically significant. But as in the lecture by Javier, I also agree that sometimes significance tests aren't the kind of most important thing you have to do, because it's also a question of interpretation and assessment about how the results relate to the particular data you're using. I have to say at this point that I'm not entirely happy with the word realism. It comes from Macroscope and Ylikoski, so I'll stick to it, but I might prefer another one. But I hope the distinction is clear. All right, so keeping to this distinction, I'm just going to give an example from the NewsEye project where I worked for some time. And on the left-hand side, I hope it's on the left-hand side for you as well. You see a paper by Sara Oberbichler and Eva van Zelte, in which they use topic modeling to create a newspaper corpus that they can analyze qualitatively. So they use a machine learning method to, in a very instrumentalist way, get at something that they were interested in. On the right-hand side, you see 3 papers that are closer to maybe this kind of realist way, or this even quantitative way. Those are all papers I was involved in, and those are the cases I'm going to talk about today. So this is, I'm not trying to put like 3 papers against 1 paper. That's not the aim here. I just needed the 3 papers so I can introduce them to you for the purpose of this talk. But before I go to those papers, I'll make one more distinction about perspectives in doing digital analysis. And I think it's sometimes useful to try to delineate between exploration, providing proof, and doing interpretation in doing digital history, basically. And of course, these kind of float into one another. But I like to think that in each research project, there is a stage, often in the beginning, sometimes it's surprisingly late, that is purely explorative. So you use different methods in order to understand your data, in order to kind of figure out new hypotheses, in order to sort of play around with your thinking and also understanding the methods. This is a really, really important stage in any research project. But I should also say that this is not the same thing as providing proof. So sometimes the kind of exploration gives you ideas, and then you work into the stage where you're talking to an audience and you want to make an argument. And then sometimes the kind of explorative graphs or whatnot you may have might actually be something that led you to think in a way, but they are not good proof of that. So then the next step is to try to figure out what you can show either quantitatively or qualitatively, that is, like, give some kind of facts that you can base your interpretation on. The interpretation aspect here is also something that I think that should be kept separate from providing proof, in the sense that we often talk about digital humanities in general, about the kind of why question, why are we doing this, and so what? Like, what is the new thing we are learning? And quite often, people in the digital humanities, digital history, we are really good at then providing proof. We are really good at handling data. We're really good at also talking about the problems we have in our data and how to get around them and things like that. But then we sometimes struggle with are we really providing new arguments versus in relation to earlier research that was maybe non-digital or something like that. And I want to maintain that when we do that, the kind of new things we come up with happen in interpretation. So that's where the strength of humanities research is. Often we think that maybe digital humanities is something that brings in a natural science way of dealing with humanities research, and to a certain degree it does. But still, where we come up with interesting things, it's still in the section of interpretation. It's when we have our quantitative analysis and we piece them together with qualitative findings, and we relate it to earlier research, and we think a little bit freely, and that's where we come up with the interesting stuff. So humanities research isn't interesting without interpretation, but I also want to say that it's good to think about when we are laying facts about that come from the data, and when we move to the sphere of interpretation. All right, with those words, I'll move on to the case studies. Again, I said we need to separate them, but it's also clear that you can't separate the three. So everything is a little bit murky, as always. All right, the three case studies I'm going to talk about all involve different methods, and I'm going to say something about how I think those methods work in my own experience for historical research with historical newspapers. It may sometimes sound that I'm being like really critical of them, and that's not really the point of this. I'm more trying to say that they are better apt for some research questions, whereas not for all of them. So they have separate, in a way, properties. And the first one was using topic modeling. Here I worked together with Elaine Sosa and Simon Hengchen, who are topic modeling specialists. Also Lydia Pivovarova, who's a computer scientist, together with Elaine in Helsinki, was part of sort of designing the computational side of the study. And then it was Mikko Tolonen and myself who were sort of doing the historical interpretation part in this case. And the starting point was to somehow confront the kind of old tradition of being a good historian with the new tradition of dealing with data and doing data-driven stuff. So the question to us we started pondering about was how to be kind of true to the past and still be relevant to the present, because it's been something that historians have been talking about extensively. I have some quotes here that are relevant, but I'm just going to skip them a little bit. But the idea for historians has been that of course we always write history from the perspective of the present, but the good historian is able to somehow bring forward the perspective of the past and put these into dialogue. But this is, in an interesting way, challenged when you approach history through a historical data set. So at least in theory, you could approach a historical data set in a completely data-driven way, so that you're not somehow polluted by ideas of the present. Of course, this is not completely possible, but still, working from a kind of data-intensive or even data-driven way kind of challenges this old idea of historians having that craft where they can sort of talk for the present, of the present and for the present. So we were really interested in, if we take a set of Finnish newspapers, can we somehow get at the things that kind of disappeared, that aren't relevant for us today anymore? Are they somehow retrievable from the data, and is it something that we maybe forgot? I mentioned we used the dataset provided by the National Library of Finland. In this case, we focused on Finnish language newspapers from the latter half of the 19th century. And we wanted to do this by topic modeling. That was the specialty of Elaine Sosa and Simon Hengchen. And we tested two topic modeling methods, Lda and Dtm. The difference here is that they deal differently with temporal change. So Dtm is dynamic topic modeling, which starts with slicing the data into time slices and then connecting topics over time slices. We assumed that we were dealing with kind of discursive data, so language data, but we're not. It's been clear in this room already when we talked about topic models that it's not always clear what a topic is, but it's also not always clear what a discourse is when humanities scholars talk about discourses. So we had two kind of semi-murky concepts that we were working with. But still we wanted to try. And I'm going to just really quickly walk through some of the results. So this is the first thing I got as a historian, a visualization of 50 topics of the data over time done in DTM. And I started going through each one of them, looking at the words in each topic and looking at the salience of the words in them and how the topics developed over time. And as you know, when you do topic modeling, sometimes some topics seem very coherent, others seem completely incoherent. So I'll go through some of the more coherent ones and something that I felt like, okay, so this makes sense to me as a historian. So we got a topic about education that was clearly on the rise during this period. And we had a topic on religion that related a lot to religious offices that was clearly in decline over the period. This kind of matched my intuition also that this would make sense. I would also inspect each of the topic by going through heat maps of the most salient words in all of the topics. These are in Finnish. I'm not going to start translating them, but this is about the religious offices. So you see there is some fluctuation within the dynamic topic model, which one would also assume. But what was also clear in the dynamic topic modeling, and it was more clear in other topics, that it does this kind of stretching that wasn't intuitive to me as a historian. And one example of that was one topic that was clearly about the Finnish currency, the mark, that was introduced in 1860. So it's a very focused topic. But there is the weird thing that you find this topic already before the mark was introduced. And I'll show you the heat map here. So if you look at where 1860 happens, you get the most salient words in the topic are mark and then penny, which is 100th of the mark. And before that, you have a quite different emphasis within the topic. And this is what the dynamic topic modeling in a way does. So it's something that I, as a historian, thought that computationally it makes sense. To me, it's hard to interpret this. I can figure out what happened here, but maybe it's not producing the kind of results that I'm entirely comfortable with. So then let's look at the LDA results just quickly. And here the results are similar but slightly different. I'll just give, I think, one or two examples. Here in the orange, you see a kind of topic that relates to public communication from the top down, and that topic is clearly in decline, whereas in yellow you see a topic that's on the rise, that is about civic engagement and a more of like a bottom-up. So in a way, this is a story of civic mobilization in Finland represented in 2 topics. So it's a really neat story. But then again, it's only 2 topics out of 50, and it feels a little bit hand-picked. Also in LDA, I did a collection of looking at which topics were in decline, so I could assess them individually. And we see again a church religious theme. We see imperial announcements that I just mentioned, forests, and then some of the nature and agricultural related topics in decline. All right, so just some remarks about using LDA and DTM here. And one of the main things is understanding this kind of stretching that DTM does. So that, I think, was an important finding for myself in assessing in how much I want to use topic modeling and which kind of topic modeling to get that historical change. LDA was clearly more sensitive to ruptures in the material, so where we wanted to build continuities, the kind of continuities had to come from my humanistic interpretation, but that's where I was also more free from the kind of tyranny of the DTM stretching. So many of the historical hypotheses we had, we sort of could semi-confirm. And quite interestingly, I mean, we were interested in these topics in decline, but it seemed like also using DTM and LDA in both cases, it was somehow much easier to find, and I didn't talk that much about them, the topics that felt coherent and then were also kind of on the rise, so they grew in prominence over the time. So it almost felt like there was a presentist bias also in the machine learning method. I know that there isn't, but there is maybe something in my own thinking that also produced this kind of presentism. But then I want to raise one final issue with regards to the topics, and it has to do with my uncertainty of dealing with what topics actually are at a given stage when I see the list of words and what they represent. So I mentioned the religious topic, and at some point I asked Elaine and Lydia if they could simply take the most salient words in that topic and plot relative frequencies of those words, so I could get some hard facts on how, like count-based facts on how they are developing. And they were first a bit insulted because they are computer scientists and they were machine learning specialists and they didn't want to do methods from the 1970s. But then in the end they did that. And actually here is an interesting tension that to me, the results coming from the word frequencies seem much more intuitive. But again, I wouldn't have figured out to do this if I hadn't started by exploring the topics. All right, I'll just break for 10 seconds and I'll take the next one and I'll run through this one as well. This was done together with Jussi Kurumäki, who is my political scientist colleague, and we've been working a lot on conceptual history and the history of political language, and we've been working on ideology and isms. And we worked in this case together with Elaine Sosa and Lydia Pivovarova, again because we wanted to do a computational study where we could hopefully prove some of our hypotheses about the development of ideological language. Now I'll just run really quickly through this. So what we were interested in are isms, so things like liberalism, socialism, conservatism, anarchism. So isms that are most often understood as somehow relating to ideology. But then, of course, if you just take the suffix ism, then that's a more broader phenomenon. So you also have religious isms, you have scientific isms, you have medical isms, and you have isms that relate to arts and culture and whatnot. And basically, why we find isms interesting is that they are somehow really reductive terms. So liberalism is something very complex that is reduced into one word so we can communicate about it. But often we actually don't agree what liberalism is. So I think in this room we can talk about liberalism for quite a while, and then at some point we'll realize that we're talking about slightly different things. And that's why they make for a good historical case to understand how notions of liberalism have changed and how they are attached to this one word. So we've been doing quite a few qualitative studies with some quantitative elements. But now we wanted to do something more advanced using digitized newspapers. And we had this idea that over the course of the 19th century, this vocabulary of isms really expands. And we wanted to be able to describe that in a better way than just saying that it expands. At this point, I should say that we used both the Swedish language and Finnish language subcorpora of newspapers published in Finland. The good thing with this is that it allowed us to compare within one country. And we did this in a way that we sliced the data into 20-year time slices. And this is quite important for the reminder of the talk. All right. We used word embeddings here, so a word-to-vec implementation. And there is one limitation here. So we did the word embeddings for each of the isms, and then we would cluster them together with something called affinity propagation clustering. But we could only include isms that appear 100 times or more within this corpus of 20 years. So this limits us to a certain degree. So for instance, for Finnish, we didn't include the word feminismi. So feminism, because it didn't appear enough times. But for Swedish, we did include this because we had more occurrences in the data. All right. The reason we used affinity propagation clustering is that we didn't want to choose how many clusters we would have per time slice, because we had this idea of the expansion of this ismatic vocabulary. So you know, when you do topic modeling and you have to choose 100 or 50 or 5 topics, and that goes then constantly over the whole period, that was something we wanted to avoid, because we had the idea that this would not represent the historical development in a good way. So we did two things. We took all the ism words and clustered them together per time slice, and then linked them to one another. And in a second experience, we took all the ism words and their and similar words in distributions, and then produced clusters that would include at least one ism, and then see what are the kind of neighboring words, what would be the kind of semantic field of those isms, and how that changed over time. I'm mostly going to talk about the first one. So this is what we got. Each of the boxes are these clusters, and they are here in time slices. Now, the first page is in Swedish. So in the left upper corner, we just have one cluster with 3 isms. In the right corner, we advanced to 4 clusters with quite a few more isms. So this is affinity propagation in work. So for the first time slice, we only get 1 cluster. For the second, we get 4. And then in the bottom half, we're working already with the 60s and the 70s. We get quite a few more isms that appear above the threshold of 100, and they are clustered in quite a few new topics. The fun thing with working with isms is that they are quite easily translatable. So these are in Swedish, but I gather most of them are still readable to you. But you don't have to read them now. These are the Finnish ones, but for the later period, so starting from the 1860s only one cluster. Finnish publishing kicks in a bit later in Finland in the 19th century, so that's why it differs. But already when you look at the early 20th century, there are really a lot of these. These are the Swedish clusters then visualized in a Sankey chart, and this was basically what we were aiming at from the very beginning. And in a way, this is our main result also. So we start from the 1820s, see this cluster with patriotism as the most dominantism and then despotism as an exemplar, and then we kind of get to see this expansion of the isms field as a whole, but then also a clear, distinct category. If you look at the right upper corner, the four first clusters are these quite distinctly political clusters of isms. And if you go through the whole period, they kind of coherently stick together. All right. We also looked at the semantic properties of individualisms by using this second experiment, but I'm just going to run through that. And we also compared the ismatic language in Finnish and Swedish, where the main difference is that we had a lot more socialist discourse in Finnish, which is not surprising at all. All right. Again, if you're interested in the historical arguments we are making, you can look up the paper. It's available online. But I'll say something about using word2vec as a method in this case. And one major issue is, of course, that there is a lack of transparency here, which maybe wasn't that problematic in this case, but it still made me a little bit uneasy about what we can say is historical proof here and where interpretation starts. Let's put it that way. What I found really successful in this was the use of affinity propagation clustering, so we didn't have to decide on the number of clusters. I think that fit much better the historical development we were trying to describe. But again, there is some sense to lack of transparency in how affinity propagation clustering clusters together the isms. All right. Another 15-second break. I'll let you stretch a little bit. And soon I'll be through with my marathon of 3 cases, and I'll get to conclusions. But all right. So then it's the final one. It's called Studying the Historical Semantics of Finnishness with a Bigram Approach, something like that. I might have changed the title a little bit. This one I did together with Antti Kanner and Eetu Mäkelä, who are like Mikko Tolonen and I from the Helsinki Computational History Group. Eetu is a computer scientist by training. He's a professor at the Digital Humanities Unit, and Antti Kanner is a linguist by training. And here we devised a study where we wanted to look at the semantic properties of one word. And that is the word Finnish. And it's I think it must be like the top most boring thing to have a Finn talking about Finnish newspapers using the word Finnish, and it gets like I'm slightly embarrassed of doing this, but I'll try to explain why I think this is an interesting case. So the starting point is to look at the year 1809, which is the year when most of what is today Finland became part of the Russian Empire. So from having been part of Sweden, in a way switching empires as a part of the whole thing with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Now, we had 2 aims with this paper. In a way, we wanted to contribute to the historiographical discussion about nation building and understanding the construction of the Finnish nation, basically, but then also to contribute a little bit to the methodological discussion in the digital humanities. And I'm not going to go much into the historical debate here, but there is a very long and rich discussion about what Finland was before 1809 and what started happening after 1809. And it's clear because there were Finns, people talked about Finns, but then of course there is this whole integration in the Swedish realm, which was much more organic, let's put it that way, than the integration into the Russian Empire after 1809. So this institutional shift clearly produced differences in how people saw what Finnishness and what Finland was. There's no question about it that like something happens, all right? So in a way, if our study is only about showing that the semantics of Finnish, the word change from before and after 1809, it's like everyone knows this. That's not what we were trying to prove, but we wanted to do this in a better way. Let's put it that way. So what we did was that we limited our corpus because there aren't that many newspapers published at this time. In Finland, in the so-called Swedish era, there was only one newspaper published basically, and that was in Turku, Åbo. And it started appearing in 1771, called Tidningar utgivna av Sällskapet Åbo. So a Swedish language newspaper published in Turku in the 1770s. So we thought, let's look at how they use the term Finnish. But in order to somehow compare, we wanted to look at the other part of the Swedish realm. So we looked at Lunds Veckoblad, who was another kind of regional newspaper in Skåne, Scania, that also had a kind of university focus to it. So let's compare these two. And then we also compared to some Stockholm papers, but it's in gray in the slide now because I'm going to skip that. And then finally we compared to a Turku newspaper from the 1830s. So a paper from the post-1809 period. So that's the main comparison. Before 1809, after 1809. And you see there's quite a few years from the 70s to the 1830s. So we wanted to make sure that we had more than 2 generations basically there, so that there would be ample time for kind of semantic change taking place. And what we did is we simply looked at bigrams. So we would look at Finnish as an adjective modifier and the nouns that the adjective modifier modifies. So constructions like the Finnish nation. But the important thing here is that, of course, the noun actually tells you about the semantic properties of the adjective here. So if you think of pairs like Japanese car or Chinese food, Russian poetry, Irish coast, you have all these ethnonyms, demonyms there. But actually they are slightly different. So Chinese food is Chinese food regardless of where you eat it or where it's produced, whereas the Irish coast can only be the Irish coast on the Irish coast, right? So the nouns kind of determine what kind, the semantic properties of the ethnonym or demonym here. And so we wanted to look at these couples when it comes to the term Finnish. And we from the get-go, we decided, okay, there are 5 alternatives. So Finnish something could denote geography, language, nationality, statehood, or territory. And this is what we decided we would look at. And the idea was that if we see shifts in these, we kind of also can trace the semantic limits of the conceptual limits of Finnishness, but also the kind of changes that took place. And the fun thing is that it does produce a Venn-gram, and I have one rule, and it's if you can do a Venn-gram, do a Venn-gram. So first we started with the 70s paper, Tidningar utgivna av Sällskapet Åbo. and compared the terms Finnish and Swedish. And here are some examples. And in the middle, you see the nouns that they share. So Finnish book, Swedish book, Finnish city, Swedish city, so on. And I started going through these manually. If you look at just the shared ones, you see that they are mostly about geography, so city, or then it's about language. So it's the terms book, congregation, and name denote language. Quite often I had to go to the actual examples to look at this. So I wouldn't only look at the biograms themselves, but I would actually read the text to say, is this about language or geography? Then there's the question of the bourgeoisie or burghers, which is ambiguous in this sense. So it could denote state structures because it relates to the estate diet, but it could also be about nationality. And to a certain extent, it could also be about geography. So that's ambiguous in this case. Looking at, so I did a marking of all of these, also looked at the ones that relate to the state and to the nation and territory. I went through them and then in the end produced this graph according to our 5 categories. So getting a sense of the distributions of these categories for the word Swedish on your left and for the word Finnish on your right. And what you see when you compare the word Swedish and Finnish in this Swedish language newspaper published in Turku in the 1770s is that the domains of language and geography, so in orange and yellow, were much more present, much more dominant in talking about Finnishness than Swedishness, which makes perfect sense. So then if we compare to this newspaper from Scania, so the Lund one, which didn't talk much about Finnishness, but it talked about Skånsk or Scanianism. So we can then compare between these. Well, let's see. So first, the sanity check here is that the paper from Finland and the paper from Scania, so from the southernmost tip of Sweden, use the word Swedish in a more or less the same way. The domains are more or less the same. Whereas if you compare the terms Finnish and Skånsk, the difference is that Finnish is much more often about language, whereas Skånsk is not. All right, and then if we move on to compare with the 1830s Turku paper, we can again look at some similarities and differences. If we look at the term Swedish, they come across as fairly similar. The perspective of the territory is not that present, but it was never very dominant in any way, and it was the most complicated one of our categories anyway. Whereas if you look at the term Finnish, we see that there is a decrease in the language aspect of using that term in the post-1809 setting, and there is an increase in the state aspect of talking about Finnishness. All right. So I'm not going to repeat those things. We see that we can distinguish between the discourse on Swedishness and Finnishness in the 1770s. We see that there is the comparison with Skåne in the 1770s also yields some interesting results, and we can see a clear shift, although not a super surprising one, when it comes to looking at the 1830s versus the 1770s. So there are some things with the method that I find quite useful, and the first one is that we were able to work on a quite fine-grained level. So as I started by saying that this is in a way a non-topic, because it's a clear thing that change happened, but I think we were able to show in a bit more detailed way what kind of change happened. What is also useful here is that this is very transparent, because it's quite literally just counting quoting words according to categories. So maybe someone does the same counting and ends up with different results, and then we have to have a discussion. But basically, I think this is very transparent. This method also scales down, at least to a certain point. So it can be used with quite small data sets, which is the case now. So just one very small newspaper published twice a week from the 70s for a few years, and then looking at one newspaper from the 1830s. These are quite small amounts of data. All right, so I'll try to put this comparison into a table, talking about the three cases I mentioned. So the discourse dynamics paper, the isms paper, and then the Finnishness papers. And I'll go through them line by line. I don't know if that works, but I'll do that anyway. So the first one used topic models. The second one used word embeddings and affinity propagation clustering. And then the third one was based on bigram counts. And there is a difference in scope in these. So the first one aimed at taking the whole data, understanding some major shifts in the whole data, and that's where we opted for topic models. In the isms case, we were interested in a particular set of words and their distributions. So it was already more focused in that sense. Whereas the third case on Finnishness was simply focusing on one word only and like very delineated in that sense. In terms of, in the beginning I talked about exploration and providing proof and interpretation, so I'll come back to that a little bit. So the first case was basically very explorative. So we were really just playing with the idea of how can we in a data-driven age touch upon this historian's dilemma of trying to be true to the past in a new way. So basically it was about testing the methods. In the latter two cases, the explorative element was much smaller. We had a quite clear hypothesis from the get-go. And actually in the third case, I would say that you can't call that data-driven in any way. It was simply, we had this idea and we just want to describe the historical development better, so let's do that. With regard to providing proof, I think using topic models is often not a good way of trying to prove something, because it is very hard to tell what, it's not very hard to tell what topics are, it's just that different topics are topics for different reasons. When you do the topic modeling and you get the 100 topics or 50 topics, some of them are coherent, some of them are incoherent, but they are also coherent for different reasons, so they aren't really comparable to one another. So that's why it's really hard to actually give proof about what the historical change here is. In the word embeddings case, I think we are closer to something that's like reasonable proof, but there is the black boxing element with using word2vec in this case. And in the third case, we are producing facts about how many times the word Finnish was used together with certain head nouns, but of course, here are some issues with OCR, and there are some issues with the categorization, which can never be unambiguous or completely unambiguous. In terms of interpretation, in all three cases, interpretation kind of starts quite early. So with the topic modeling, when we get the topics, that's where our brain starts sort of, like we get these weird topics and then we try to make sense of them. And humans have like an amazing capability of trying to make sense of whatever results a machine learning algorithm produces to us. And that's what we do. And sometimes it works really nicely, and sometimes we just have to accept that, okay, so what we get is rubbish, and actually this is not a good method. But anyway, the interpretation starts quite quick early on. Also with the isms clusters, whenever we have had the clusters, that's where I was clearly moving to the sphere of interpretation, trying to make sense of it. It was sort of beyond what we could actually prove, but it was what I could tell from the story. And in the Finnishness part, I would say interpretation already started when we produced the 5 predefined categories, which we used for categorization. All right, with regard to transparency, I've mentioned this already several times. It's clear machine learning methods aren't often that transparent. Count-based methods are more transparent. There are some issues there as well, but there is a difference here. And there is obviously a difference in whether or not these scale up or scale down. So many count-based methods also scale up in the same way as machine learning methods do. But that really depends on how you've designed your study and how much manual labor you have to do. In the Finnishness case, it was designed in a way that I did a lot of manual labor, so there was a clear limit to how much that could be scaled up. But had it been designed in a slightly different way, had the OCR been better, had there been better morphological parsing, then I think it would scale up quite nicely. All right, so I guess turning to your hypothetical research projects, which I don't know what they are, but if I'm in any kind of position to make some pointers, ask questions, I'll just take this from this. So again, I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't use particular methods or you should use particular methods. It always depends on the research questions, right? And it depends on the data and what you can do. But if your study departs from machine learning methods, my suggestion would be to do something similar than what we did in the topic modeling case. So doing that kind of exploration, for instance, with topic models or word embeddings, but then also when you know where your argument is going, then having something that is more count-based and more transparent in order to show something that you can prove. And then when you're kind of doing the interpreting, you're obviously using both the more explorative results and the more kind of empirically sound results to pull together your ideas and participate in the academic conversation. If you're using something that is very manually intensive, requires lots of manual labor, then I guess the question to ask is that limiting your study? Is it limiting your study in a way that you are not actually available? Actually, you cannot participate in the debate you're participating in because you're actually limiting the scope of your study so much. And this links quite a bit to what Javier was talking about earlier on today. So about this kind of focusing on one newspaper or focusing on a particular data set because that's the data set you have and you hand curate it really thoroughly and then you analyze it. But maybe that's actually limiting what you want to do and limiting the possibilities for you to produce an argument that is compelling to the scientific community. And in a way, I would also want to end by saying that to me, it's clear that machine learning methods are very good for exploration, but not optimal for providing proof. Whereas count-based methods are good for giving proof. But here the challenge is to understand what you're actually counting and how that relates to the kind of bigger picture you want to talk about. Because often we count words, but we want to say a bit more than just that the use of this word changed over time. All right, I hope that raises some questions for you, and I'm really grateful that you bared with me for this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and I will come forwards now. Are there questions from the room? I have many again, yes.
Thank you. Many interesting topics, but I will ask about topics. So you have a topic modeling, you get 100 topics, and you look at them, and 50 is incoherent, and you somehow dismiss them. Could you describe more this process methodologically? Because I kind of see it problematic why you discard something, and then even you can ask more. Maybe even topics which seem coherent actually are not valid as well.
Sure. So I'll walk you through how we went through the topics. So actually the first stage was that that we produced topic models with 30 topics, 50 topics, and 100 topics. And then Mikko and I started going through them, and then we had this sense that the 50 topic model works best for us. This is not like we don't have any kind of numerical say assessment of that. It was our gut instinct, and that was what we went by. So then we opted for the 50 topic version, and after that I went through each one of the topics, and both for dynamic topic modeling and then for LDA. So I looked at the most salient words, and whether or not I felt that this was a coherent topic. So I would give them labels, as many of you who worked with topic models know. You give them labels that this is about this, and sometimes you get the sense that this is actually about 2 or 3 things. And then for the dynamic topic models, I went through the heat maps that I showed you. So then I would have the most salient words and look at how they develop over time within that topic. LDA is a bit different. You can't have the heat maps there because it's not, it doesn't have that kind of, well, it doesn't take the time slices into account in the same way. Now I wonder if I have an image of that. Yeah, so for LDA, I looked at this, I used this by LDA visualization where I would inspect each of the topics. You see on the right-hand side, you see the words of that topic. So this is a language topic, topic number 33. And you see the most salient words, but you also see their prominence in that topic, but then also their prominence in the whole data. So for instance, if you look at the second word there, which is Suomi, but it actually can relate to both language, but also the country Finland in this case. And you see that being Finnish newspapers, it's really prominent out there. But you can see that it's the language aspect that is present in this topic, whereas the other meanings of that word were present in other topics. So I would do this kind of inspection of all the topics. Now, this is something that I often ask when I hear papers about that use topic models. Is like, how many rubbish topics did you have, and how many coherent topics did you have? And no one ever answers that, and I don't have a numerical answer here either. So we simply, based on this assessment, we looked more closely at those that we felt made sense. You are quite right that some of the topics that come across as coherent might actually not be that useful, or they might be somehow, they might be somehow put together in a different way than other topics that are coherent. And maybe the example of this is the topic about the mark that I talked about, that there was this kind of, I felt that there was a chronological combination of 2 different topics in a way. But then, of course, there are no topics in history. You have that chunk of language data, and topic models is a way of ordering that into chunks, and it's a heuristic for us, but it's not something that is there for us to grasp. It's not something that's in the past. It doesn't correspond to anything that anyone in history would say that like if we do a topic modeling and I see that, okay, so this is a religious topic. And then if I had the possibility of going to the past and talk to a person and ask them to point in a newspaper which are the texts that fit in a religious topic, that would surely not match with what we get from topic modeling. And I think that's reasonable, because if we could, like if that was possible, if we could get that kind of topic models, that would solve many of our problems, but I really don't think that's possible. I hope that answers your question. I got into a long rant.
Didn't you use the topic coherence measures in the paper you were referencing?
Yeah, in the paper we had have a discussion about that. Yes, I can't come. So that's on Elaine's and Simon's table. So I can't give you the.
Many thanks. That was super cool to listen and to see the project in sequence there. What I was wondering is about the coherence of the measures you made, for example, for the ISMS project and for the discourse discovery approach that you did. Did you see variations across different newspaper titles? Because we take the whole corpus that is there, we run the analysis, and then we measure something. But if you go down one level and look, are there some titles that are more prominent, have more isms than others? We can speculate there. But is that something you looked into, and would it be worthwhile to actually descend on the granularity level and make comparisons there, and then to see the figures we get? What do they mean when we contrast different titles, perhaps different liberal versus socialist versus conservative, or even challenge these categories based on the analysis that you do?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a brilliant question, and for the topic modeling paper, we did not do that. So it was also because we played with this idea. Okay, so let's take the whole data and kind of just depart from that and see where it leads us. For the ISMS one, we did look into that quite a bit more, but actually no, so I'm not going to go back there. It will take me forever to click all those slides. But in the ISM case, it was quite clear that it had to do with different paper titles, and it had to do with language quite a lot. And it also had to do with censorship. So for instance, you get this boom in different socialist isms after 1905 in Finland with the reintroduction of total press freedom. So that's where what happened was a boost in mostly Finnish language newspapers and mostly socialist Finnish language newspapers that introduced much more language that related to socialism and capitalism, and then all the kind of sub-isms of those isms. And these I would then manually look at paper by paper. So it was also possible to see that that some papers were really producing this kind of language, and it showed. But it had to do with the political affiliations of the paper, but it also had to do with censorship in the country. And I have to say, in this case, we had a super good peer reviewer who really pushed us to, like, on the one hand, there were always these comments about methods, but then it was like, can you give us more historical examples? And I was really happy about that in a digital humanities journal, that there was a person like, okay, so we need more quotes, we need more examples from the newspapers, we need more information about the political affiliations of the particular newspapers. So I did quite a bit of reading, and you could see this element. There are also quite clear ism clusters when it comes to papers who produced a lot of religious content, when it comes to kind of topics like spiritualism and kind of isms that relate to psychology and well-being and something like that, that were really topics that were kind of pushed by certain papers, which also in hindsight makes perfect sense. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have several less formal questions. So I know that in Helsinki for several years already you developed this system where you work in teams with programmers together with humanists, and it allows for the humanists not to be an expert expert programmer or expert in machine learning and still use these methods. But can you describe your creative process, how you come up with new research ideas? Are they coming more from a humanist side, or somebody in your center says, okay, we want to work with Jensen board to Beck right now, and what could we do with that? Or it's a mixed...
All right, yeah, okay, so thank you so much. It's a wonderful question, and I'll see if I can answer that, because you see, my spontaneous, when you asked like, how do you start? And then my spontaneous reaction was that, oh, of course, like I come up with the idea and then when we do it. And now when I start thinking about it, that's not at all the case. So sometimes it's us, the historians or the linguists, who have an idea about like a humanities case that we put into practice. Quite often it's Mikko Tolonen or myself or someone else in the group. But actually now when I think of it, like we have quite a few cases where actually it's also come from the perspective of let's try this method and what can we do? Can we invent a historical case that would match this, or can we relate it to some kind of debate in historiography that would somehow be apt for this? So we've actually gone all kinds of ways here. And if I may just talk a little bit about the hackathon, it's something that Mikko Tolonen and Eetu Mäkelä and others invented in Helsinki, and we've been doing for 8 times now. So each spring we collect groups of students from the BA level to PhD students who then convene for 8 days and do a super intensive research case that is then supervised by some of us. And usually we divide into 4 or 5 groups. And that has, it works in a way that the group meets, they have a given data set and they have a given topic, but not an exact research question. And then the first meeting, we start talking about the research question, and then things just start happening. So sometimes it's the computer scientists who are very driven and they want to do something. Sometimes there is a humanist student or scholar who wants to do something. We talk a little bit about what kind of expertise people have in the group, and then it kind of flies away. And if that is an option for you, I really recommend applying to that. I think myself, I've been leading a group for quite a few years, and I really enjoy doing that. But the thing is also that it's become a model that we use in our research group as well. So it's some like, let's do a mini hackathon. Because for many of us, the hackathon is the nicest experience in doing research. So it's like a limited time, let's focus on this thing only. Like, let's have a monotopic week where we do this together and just focus on this and brainstorm and things like that. Of course, the time limit in the hackathon is 8 days. So then at some point you'll have to say that, okay, so on this point, we can't do full evaluation because we don't have time to do that. But for a research paper, we will need more time to do full evaluation and things like that. But it's really become a model for us. Yeah, thank you.
Let's see. Do we have questions in chat? Yeah, there are thanks. Correct me if I'm missing something. I don't see new questions here. But we have still time before we break for lunch, and I just maybe to continue with this informal conversation. Myself, I'm not an experienced researcher. I was working more in a library setting, as a developer of services, but I have now tried to write a few articles, and what I noticed is that they often follow the same scheme. So we pick a digital method, we pick a data set, then we apply the method to the data set, and it's like, oftentimes it's like a case study. So we demonstrate what we could do with this method, with this data, and say, okay, moving further, we could do this or that with that. But it stops short on like interpreting really the results. And in theory, we could write another article where we would go in depth with the humanistic interpretation of what we found. But it almost never happens. So in my life, it didn't happen so far. We go next to the next case study and never linger to the interpretation. How is it in your experience? Are you writing articles still that are not describing digital methodology, but just already moving forwards with the interpretation that is based on the previous analysis?
All right, thank you so much. That's a brilliant question, and if I may, I'll start by disagreeing with you a little bit. So I remember listening to your paper on Latvian poetry in DHN. It wasn't DHNB then yet, it was DHN in Gothenburg, and I felt that we were well beyond on the level of interpretation. So I'll disagree a little bit about that respectfully. But I think you're very much onto something, and there are quite a few things that are at play there. So in many of the cases I've been involved in, in a way, we've split the project. So let's do some publications that are geared more towards digital humanities audience, or even computer science audience. Well, not that much computer science audience, but let's say a computational humanities, digital humanities audience, and then do something that is more geared towards the humanities and social science audience. So that would be kind of splitting the thing. It's also because quite often when we were submitting into traditional humanities journals, we would get the kind of response that, like, you discuss your methods really thoroughly, and we find that very long and boring. So could you go to the historical stuff? Which is, to me as a historian, it's like kind of nice to hear that there are also other people who are interested in history, but still it's really problematic, because usually we work in a group, and we have people who have been responsible for the computational methods, and they've done the computational analysis, and there's no way for us to just chuck that out and not present everything, and not make it transparent, and also not to give praise to the people who have done the work. So in that case, often the model is in a way to split the publication. So there is one publication that can be more technical. It can be more of a discussion about the application of the methods, and then one publication that kind of builds on that, but is geared more towards a humanities audience. But having said that, I also feel increasingly that that for me to be really interested in the project, I want to have a starting point in the field of history, where I feel like I'm contributing to a debate in history, and then I simply do use digital methods. They can be machine learning methods, they can be count-based, but for me it's more interesting to put that work into it if I feel that I am actually contributing already to a debate within history, and trying to design these case studies in a way that are already geared towards the historians who do not at all care about machine learning, but saying that, like, you have to care about this because it will, the results we are providing actually force you to rethink these things. At least hopefully. Yeah, hopefully, I think sometimes, yes.
So you are closer to my computer,
right, yeah.
So if you see questions, Yes, this is no. This is my private chat. So no. Yeah. By the way, do you feel that you can be flexible in how far you go with using digital methods? Like how many methods you can try out during your career? For example, if you are a Korean medievalist, you like want to go to like to some other branch of history, but in digital humanities, like you would work with topic models, then maybe in 2 years you will be working with graphs. Do you think that there is no limit to how many methods you should try, or you should stick to being a topic model specialist and maybe like word embeddings on the side?
I don't think I can give you a good answer. I think that's a lot about like how you are as a person and what you are comfortable with learning and relearning and then comparing things. I do think it's good to do a few different things. For me, I like working with historical language. So that is kind of my training in studying changes in historical language qualitatively, looking at political concepts and so on. So that's why I also easily jump to digital humanities methods that are quite word-centered or well, at least work with language data. But I mean, that's also where a hackathon is good, because in the hackathon context, you can spend 8 days working on a method with a method that you haven't tried before, and in that group you learn quite quickly. So this year I worked with a group that worked completely with networks of mentions in parliamentary data, and for me it was completely new, and I learned a lot. And I don't think I'll be going there with my own stuff, but it did put some of my own stuff into a new perspective.
During the exploration of new computational methods, are you trying to really understand all the nuts and bolts, the maths that underlie the method, or you rely on your colleagues that they are understanding this method and you're just doing a group thing rather than?
Well, I mean, I try to understand as much as possible, but then we also have a clear division of labor. But it also seems to me that it's a bit different when a computer scientist applies word embeddings than when a computational linguist does, because they also have different perspectives on these methods. I think there's been a lot of debate, for instance, about word distributions and how they relate to semantic similarity, for instance. And that's something that, as a historian, I'm not well equipped to deal with. But having done a few cases where we use word embeddings, and then having a few cases where we look at distributions in other ways, I think I'm constantly learning new things, and I have a better sense of how language works. So I'm becoming a hobby linguist in doing my digital humanities stuff. But of course, it helps a lot to have a person who really does know how to do the computation, who is an expert in statistics or does know the linguistic stuff, and then I can be the historian of the group.
Can I ask you, in practice, when you work in interdisciplinary teams, do you feel that everybody has the feeling to produce something novel, or do you take turns and say, like, sometimes you validate computer science research by saying this is actually relevant, sometimes the computer scientists help you out to do something in political history of language? Is there like a silent agreement, like, you know, I helped you get one of your papers, now I help you to get one of yours? Is that how it works in your group?
Yeah, I think there's there's an ideal, and then there is a practice, and they don't always meet. But what we try to do is have a discussion about this quite openly, and I think I think the important thing is that like sometimes a case is really driven by someone's research interest, and then that kind of organizes the work quite nicely. So someone wants to do something but needs help from others as well. But sometimes the thing is more organic, it's more hackathon, like it's kind of you meet in a group and let's do this, what could we do? Would this be a good way of doing it? And then we'll play with things, we'll do some exploration, and then we end up with something. And that's where I think it's quite important to, at the beginning of the process, have a discussion about what each and everyone wants to get out of it, and then also at the end have that discussion about what each and everyone actually did, and were they happy with that. And of course, like with any collaboration, that's where you also have a potential conflict, but I think the reasonable way of dealing with that is to have that discussion.
Thank you. Maybe my very last question. It's almost off topic. As a researcher, do you think that you are missing something from the point of view either of the infrastructure or the availability of data, availability of resources in your research center? If you had a wish list, what you need apart from what you already have?
If I had a wish list, of course I have a list here. I can give it to you, and then we can. So I think this goes maybe back to the discussion about working in groups and then working individually, because of course sometimes I also do a case completely on my own, and it might be quite qualitative, it also might be some quite quantitative sometimes. But what I would like to have as a researcher is to, whenever I am trying to do something and I hit a wall and I realize that, so there is some kind of technical thing, it might have to do with programming, or it might have to do with data availability or something like that. That's when I would want to go to a friendly person at the library or my research center, whose job it would be to try to help me with that. That's maybe quite high on my wish list, but I don't know how that would be kind of devised in practice.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause. And
Thank you.
And we going to lunch break right now. We have more than an hour left for our break. We will meeting again 20 minutes past 1. When we again split into groups, Python track and R track. And for those who are watching the stream, see you tomorrow at the lecture given by Raivis Viluns about data journalism in the afternoon. Thank you.